Have you ever felt scared that one day you might just disappear and people will be left clueless as to what happened? Well, this had happened to a sweet little girl named Lindsey, and her vanishing left her entire community in shock. Stay tuned to find out what happened, how it happened, and how the people reacted. June 26, 2009 will be in the memories of many for setting a new benchmark in the danger of feeling at home. It was dawn when the sun began to dip below the horizon with hues of orange and purple above McCleary, Washington, with absolutely nothing out of the ordinary happening that summer evening in this small town where life went at a slow rhythm. Kids rode along the sidewalks on their bikes. Laughter circulated through the air, and neighbors sat casually, reminiscing life on their front porches. That idyllic ambiance created the feeling of safety, a belief that bad things didn't happen in their very close-knit community. That night, Lindsey Baum, a bright 10-year-old girl with a laugh very contagious and a wild imagination, was at a friend's house. She is the kind of girl who would love adventure and stories of far-off lands. And what about the more daring heroes? Her friends just loved her for that. As it began getting sunsetty, Lindsey's mind was filled with all the thrills of childhood, sleepovers, secrets, and maybe even something the future might bring. Lindsey said her goodbyes and walked out into the cool air at 9:15 p.m. She felt safe walking home, knowing every turn and tree on the way was a familiar landmark, like going by heart. Her route was almost an extension of her backyard. Lindsey hummed a tune as she walked, her song merging with the whispers of the evening breeze. She had her mother, Melissa Baum, waiting at home for Lindsey to return by 9:30 p.m. Melissa was an overprotective mother who had made a full-time job out of raising her daughter. She had raised Lindsey as a fiercely independent girl, but down in the inner recesses of her mind lay a permanent fear, an unquenchable anxiety about the world outside the walls of their home. The hours dragged on, and Melissa felt a knot twisting in her stomach. Maternal instincts were kicking into high gear. It was 9:45 p.m. when Melissa's unease became concerned. She reached into her purse and got out her phone, her fingers now a bit shaky as she dialed Lindsey's number. Each ring sounded like the dread building in her chest. Still no answer. Melissa's concern continued deepening, like a dark cloud hanging over her thoughts. Was Lindsey okay? Had she just lost track of time, or was something seriously wrong? At 10 p.m., when the clock struck its ominous chime, Melissa had had enough and ventured out into the darker street to look for her daughter. The familiar streets now seemed sinister and menacing. "Lindsey! Lindsey, where are you?" she cried into the night air. Her voice was a shatter in the stillness. The shadows seemed to whisper something back, but no response came. Every passing minute took its toll on panicking. Melissa ran back into the house, grabbed her car keys, and sped around the neighborhood looking at every corner, every shadow. "Please, God, just let her be safe," she begged in a whisper, as tears and desperation began boiling up inside her body. She scoured everywhere frantically, calling Lindsey's friends and neighbors, hoping someone had seen her daughter. But with each ring, her heart sank lower and lower. No one had seen Lindsey since she'd left her friend's house. Reality was slowly setting in, a parent's worst nightmare playing before her eyes. At 11 p.m., she called 911. The calm voice of the dispatcher seemed surreal as Melissa's world spun completely out of control. She reported her daughter missing. Her voice was only barely steady as she reported the specifics. "She was walking home from a friend's house. It's just 10 blocks. She should be home by now." However, just as Melissa saw officers at her doorstep, she felt hope that maybe they would find her little girl quickly. Maybe because this was a small town, everyone kept an eye out for one another. But as the officers listened and took notes, she saw the look in their eyes. They realized what it meant. It was midnight, and a posse of voices screamed for Lindsey's head as townspeople surged into the McCleary streets. The town guard and volunteers among the townspeople had tapped into a phone tree of neighbors, friends, and local citizens. Flashlights made lanes in the darkness, throwing light into hollowed-out corners of the town. "Lindsey!" they yelled, their voices echoing off deserted streets. But with night, hope began to erode. Hours passed with no sign of Lindsey, and darkness seemed to grow into despair. The laughter of children filling the community a few hours before was heard no more. Instead, Oppressive silence had become the only sound. Melissa could feel the walls closing in as she paced in the living room, eager for some news. The day would soon unfold as an intense search for Lindsey. Volunteers and the local sheriff's department combed the forests and fields surrounding McCleary for Lindsey. Flyers with Lindsey's smiling face were plastered on every lamppost, grocery store window, and community board. "Have you seen me?" they read, accompanied by a description and a heartfelt message from her mother. Melissa searched, her heart racing from both fear and determination. Her pulse would rush at each stir in the bushes. Each minute seemed to be forever because it ticked away. She said step by step to herself, "Please, just let her be okay." Days turned into weeks as the community rallied behind Baum's family. They had vigils, lit candles, prayed for Lindsey's safe return. But as each day went by with no one taking anything from it, the weight of hopelessness deepened. Melissa was the epitome of grit, but it was taking a toll on her. She hadn't even got a wink of sleep. Instead, she was still operating on pure adrenaline and love for her little girl. The laughter of Lindsey echoed through every waking moment. She clung to hope, but doubt was now eating away at the insides. Still, the police continued their search and brought in an FBI team for help in investigating the case. They interviewed dozens of friends, family members, neighbors, and even passers-by who happened to be in the area on the night that Lindsey disappeared. They were looking for anything that could remotely lead them to find her. Melissa spent her days coordinating searches, plastering posters, and speaking out on social media about Lindsey. She became an impassioned spokesperson, addressing community meetings and raising awareness about child safety issues. But the aching sense of loss for her daughter was always there, like an armored shield over her broken heart. National media outlets started focusing their attention on Lindsey's case, with the quiet town of McCleary appearing in headlines. News anchors began reporting on the search while Melissa appeared in the fore, pleading for anyone who may have an inkling of information to come forward. "Please help us if you know anything, even the smallest detail. Lindsey is my little girl, and we want her back," she said, while tears streamed down her face. However, weeks went into months, and she was still nowhere to be seen. Each lead that the sheriff's department followed only ended up being a dead end. It seemed that the case was going nowhere, a development that wouldn't help Melissa, who started spiraling into the pit of despair. The months passed and the seasons changed, but it did not touch Melissa's heart. Each day that went by without her daughter felt like an anvil was pressed to her chest. Lindsey's room became a shrine, a painful reminder of the life that was so crudely taken from them. Her clothes hung neatly in the closet, her toys untouched in games and activities, and her books stood on shelves with dust. Melissa often sat on Lindsey's bed, curled up with all of those stuffed animals, and crying for the little girl who had brought that stream of happiness into her life. Memory itself had filled the house, but it hardly felt like living anymore. It was more an echo of a far-off past, rather than the vibrant life they once led together. And one evening, sitting there in complete silence, the weight of that loss seemed like it might engulf Melissa. She turned the pages of a photograph album filled with pictures of Lindsey's childhood, parties and vacations and just ordinary days, memories now monstrous in their recall. It was as if every photograph weighed its laughter and love but carried something else, absence. At that moment, Melissa vowed to do something. She was not going to allow Lindsey's story to fall into obscurity. She would fight for her daughter, not for justice only, but for the prevention of similar heartache upon other families. She started working with organizations that find missing children, sharing Lindsey's story at every available opportunity. The town of McCleary soon became different as the inquiry dragged on. It was once a peaceful town, but now what was to be feared became uncertain. Parents kept their children closer to them and wouldn't let them play in the streets freely. Silent playgrounds were now silent due to the absence of revelry, and the whole community had been changed by this new form of tension. Neighbors who just a week ago shared smiling waves of greeting now avoided eye contact, afraid of the darkness that had crept into their lives. The safety sense that characterized McCleary was broken, and the community could hardly imagine how to get back to life in the morning. Melissa was hopeful in that uncertain environment. She helped organize town meetings and invited the police to come and update them on the latest safety measures taken. People acquired the boldness to open up their mouths and say something, Slowly but surely, the community began coming together again. They formed a neighborhood watch so that no one left the children alone and kept an eye on everyone. But the questions persisted. What had happened to Lindsey and who was to blame for her disappearance, ending in a kind of humidity as whispers spread throughout the small town. It was now September 2017 when, 8 years since Lindsey's disappearance, a tragic event occurred. Hunters searching the isolated forest of eastern Washington came across a macabre scene. Forensic testing later established that the human remains discovered belonged to Lindsey Baum. This news shattered not just Melissa, but the entire community in McCleary. All the hope they had been holding on to all these last 8 long years had now proved to be just an unbearable truth. Their little Lindsey was gone. The cruel producer of such an unknown death was the one who had taken her from the rest of the world, whereas the community and the rest of the world felt the weight of this loss. Melissa's sorrow was palpable. It was like a tidal wave waving over her, crashing pain. Of course, one thing she did fear was that her daughter was lost. However, the knowledge that her daughter would never come back was an altogether different and worse kind of heartbreak. She had fought so hard to keep Lindsey's memory alive, but now, that very memory was tinged with sorrow. Melissa stood at the memorial site where Lindsey's remains were discovered, looking at the indescribable emptiness. The people gathered again, but this time it was not for searching, but rather to mourn over the loss of one bright and spirited girl who had once brought so much joy. Although the remains were found of Lindsey, whose case was far from over, the killer behind such an abductive murder was yet to be caught. Melissa wasn't ready to stop fighting yet. She continued, bringing her voice and whatever platform she had to ensure Lindsey's case wasn't forgotten. She went beyond the towns of McCleary and reached out to every media outlet in town, telling her story and soliciting information from those who could speak insight into the case. She became a mom on a mission, advocating missing children everywhere and seeking awareness for the dangers lurking even in the very safe haven of McCleary. Her resiliency and strength when confronted with the unimaginable tragedy stood to be that beacon of hope for other families in her shoes. As Melissa often said to remind herself, "If we don't speak up, who will?" This fight was not only about her daughter, but every single child and every single family victimized by violence and loss. The search continued, but Melissa held on to hope that someday they would find answers to the questions they had so longed for. Each lead was followed. Each tip was taken seriously and investigated. But time kept going by and frustration grew. A person who had taken away her daughter was still out there free to roam while her daughter lay in the grave. The story of Lindsey Baum is tragic and heart-wrenching, but more than that, it is the story of an almost indomitable love and strength by a mother. Melissa Baum has gone through the worst nightmares of any parent, yet she still battles in memory of her daughter and for justice. Lindsey might have faded away, but her story has just begun. Melissa's story has established proof that there is a secret source of strength, resilience, and community. In the darkest days of life, she has found comfort in connection forged with others who have experienced something similar to the tragedy. It becomes a network of support, reminding them they are not alone in the pain they feel. Even on the day she was found, Melissa continued holding vigils in Lindsey's name to bring the community together to honor her daughter's life. She shared stories of Lindsey's adventurous spirit and kind heart, reminding everybody of the good times Lindsey had bestowed upon the earth. "Lindsey would have wanted us to live, to love, and to cherish every moment," Melissa often said. "We must carry her light with us." The community responded to the call from Melissa. There were events, generating funds for missing persons organizations, and walks to raise awareness about child safety. Out of that world, which had seemed so dark, a glimmer of hope began anew. As you consider Lindsey's story, remember that there will always be a need to stand by those for whom justice is unattainable. Of course, Lindsey's case remains unsolved, but with people like Melissa, who refuse to give up, one can always hope that justice will eventually be served. Melissa's journey may have started over loss, but it has blossomed into a mission, a fight for all the missing children and their families who carry the shadow of uncertainty. Advocacy stands before the world, for the concern for abducted children and the continued telling of the story of Lindsey. In a world that can easily turn upside down and very frightening, Melissa reminds us all of the power of love and resilience. She may have lost her daughter, but never lost the spirit of keeping Lindsey alive in her mind and heart. What did you think of this shocking story? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories that need to be heard. We've always got the most interesting ones in our storybook, so make sure you tune in soon. Ciao. Curious to uncover the spine-chilling tale of Dr. Harold, aka Dr. Death? Watch the video now to dive into the shocking details that will leave you speechless.